The small town of Marigold, tucked away from bustling highways and modern skylines, was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's name, or so it seemed. The town's modest grocery store, Marigold Mart, served as the heart of the community. It wasn't grand or glamorous, but it was reliable, just like the people who worked there. James Carter, an old man in his late 70s, shuffled into the store one frosty afternoon. He wore a threadbare coat, its seams frayed from years of wear, and carried a weathered cane that tapped rhythmically against the tiled floor. His dark skin bore the marks of a life lived hard, deep creases etched by time and hardship. Despite the heaviness of his gait, James held his head high, his hazel eyes scanning the aisles with a mixture of weariness and quiet resolve. Once James had been a carpenter, his hands crafting fine furniture that had graced the homes of the wealthy. But time and circumstances hadn't been kind. A series of health setbacks, combined with the loss of his wife and dwindling savings, had left him on the brink of poverty. Now the man who once built dreams with his hands was struggling to put food on his table. That day, James wasn't just visiting the store to buy something. He was there because he had no other choice. Behind the register stood Ethan Parker, a white man in his mid-30s. Ethan was a steady presence at Marigold Mart, having worked there for nearly a decade. He was a man of routine, arriving early, keeping the shelves stocked, and always wearing a polite smile for customers. His sandy brown hair was neatly combed, and his uniform, a plain blue polo, was always pressed. Ethan took pride in his work, though it wasn't the career he'd once envisioned. Growing up, he had dreams of becoming a teacher, but life's unpredictable currents had carried him here instead. He didn't resent his job, but he often felt trapped by its monotony. He had learned to keep his interactions with customers cordial yet distant, his natural kindness tempered by years of subtle judgment and tension he'd witnessed in the community. Ethan's upbringing had taught him the importance of hard work, but it had also instilled a cautious outlook. He wasn't the type to rush into someone else's problems. Yet deep down, there was a part of him that yearned to make a difference, to prove that decency could prevail even in small, unnoticed acts. The store itself was a reflection of the town, simple, functional, and unassuming. Its fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a pale glow on the neatly arranged shelves. Rows of canned goods, fresh produce, and household essentials stretched from one end of the store to the other. A small bulletin board by the entrance displayed community announcements, missing pets, bake sales, and church events. Outside, the winter air was crisp, and a light dusting of snow covered the sidewalks. Inside, the faint hum of a heater filled the space, offering a modest warmth to the customers who wandered in. Regular patrons exchanged brief nods and greetings as they moved through the aisles, their carts rattling softly. For James, the store wasn't just a place to buy necessities. It was a reminder of what he had lost. The cheerful chatter of young mothers, the clink of coins at the register, and the smell of freshly baked bread all brought back memories of better days. For Ethan, the store was a stage where he played his role every day, rarely stepping outside the script of polite customer service. As James approached the counter with empty hands, Ethan noticed him out of the corner of his eye. There was something about the man's demeanor, his hesitant steps, the way his eyes lingered on the bread aisle, that gave Ethan pause. James seemed to be searching for something beyond groceries. Ethan felt a flicker of unease. He had seen customers like James before, people on the edge, grappling with needs they couldn't meet. Helping them was never straightforward. It often meant bending rules or facing scrutiny from others in the store. Ethan glanced at the clock, trying to suppress the growing sense that this interaction was going to challenge him in ways he hadn't anticipated. James, meanwhile, hesitated near the counter, his hand gripping the cane tightly. He was no stranger to judgment, but asking for help always felt like swallowing his pride. A quiet tension hung in the air, hinting at the moment that would soon change everything. James lingered near the counter longer than most customers would. His empty hands trembled slightly, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Finally, he took a deep breath and stepped closer to Ethan, his voice barely above a whisper. "Excuse me," son James began, his tone shaky but steady enough to command attention. I'm in a bit of a situation. I was wondering if there's any way you could help me." Ethan looked up from scanning a pack of cereal for another customer and met James's gaze. The old man's eyes held a mix of humility and quiet desperation. Ethan hesitated, unsure of what James meant. "Help you with what, sir?" Ethan asked cautiously, his voice neutral but kind. James swallowed hard. "I haven't eaten in a couple of days. Times have been tough, and, well, I was hoping there might be something you could spare. Even just some bread or milk. I wouldn't ask if I didn't need it." The air around them seemed to still. A few customers nearby glanced in their direction, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval. Ethan froze, caught off guard. His training hadn't prepared him for moments like this, and he wasn't sure what to say. Ethan's initial reaction wasn't judgmental, but cautious. He had encountered people asking for help before, and the store's policy was clear: no freebies, no exceptions. But there was something about James that felt different. This wasn't a grifter or someone looking to exploit kindness. This was a man teetering on the edge of survival. James could feel the weight of the store's atmosphere shift as the moment stretched on. His pride stung, but hunger was a far more powerful force. He had spent the better part of his life as a provider, someone who took care of others. Standing here, asking for help, felt like stripping away the last vestiges of his dignity. His mind raced with thoughts. What if they turn me away? What if they think I'm just another beggar? But alongside the shame was a glimmer of hope. James had learned, through years of hardship, that kindness could sometimes come from the most unexpected places. "I don't need much," James added, his voice soft but steady. "Just enough to get me through tonight. I promise, if I ever get back on my feet, I'll repay it." Ethan's silence gnawed at him. He fought the urge to turn around and leave, to save himself the embarrassment. But where would he go? The biting cold outside offered no answers, no solutions. Ethan's routine, so carefully constructed over years of work, was unraveling in this moment. The neatly ordered world of scanning items, offering polite smiles, and avoiding personal entanglements was suddenly upended by the raw humanity in James's plea. He glanced at the store's security cameras, knowing that management watched these interactions closely. Giving away even a loaf of bread could lead to a reprimand, or worse. Ethan's co-workers were busy stocking shelves and chatting with customers, but he felt the weight of their potential judgment too. Yet, as he looked back at James, something stirred within him. The old man's humility and vulnerability weren't something Ethan could easily brush off. He thought about his own life, about the safety net he'd taken for granted. A family who would always catch him if he fell, a steady job, a warm home. James, it seemed, had none of those things. For the first time in years, Ethan's carefully maintained boundaries felt inadequate. He realized this wasn't just about store policy or avoiding conflict. It was about deciding who he wanted to be in that moment. Ethan hesitated, the weight of James's words sinking in. As he considered what to do, a customer in line behind James cleared her throat loudly, breaking the momentary silence. "Are we going to be here all day?" she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for Ethan and James to hear. Her sharp tone drew glances from other shoppers, creating a ripple of tension through the store. Ethan looked over at James, who shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny. "I just need a moment," Ethan said to the woman, his voice firm but polite. He turned back to James, who looked like he wanted to disappear. Before Ethan could respond, another customer, a middle-aged man in a flannel jacket, stepped forward. "What's going on here?" "Is he bothering you?" the man asked Ethan, his tone protective but laced with suspicion. "No, he's not bothering me," Ethan replied quickly, his voice tightening. He glanced at James, who seemed to shrink further under the weight of the stares. The flannel-clad man frowned. "Look, buddy," he said to James, "if you're looking for handouts, this isn't the place for it." "That's enough," Ethan interrupted, surprising even himself with the sharpness of his tone. The flannel man muttered something under his breath, but stepped back. Amid the tension, a young mother with a toddler on her hip approached the counter. "It's okay," she said softly, placing a loaf of bread and a small carton of milk on the counter. "Put this on my tab for him." James's eyes widened, his lips parting as if to protest. "I thank you," he managed, his voice barely audible. The small act of kindness from the young mother sent a ripple of reactions through the group. Some customers nodded approvingly, while others exchanged skeptical glances. The flannel man scoffed and walked away, muttering, "People these days." Ethan felt a surge of relief and gratitude toward the woman, but also a nagging sense of inadequacy. Why hadn't he acted sooner? Why had he hesitated when this woman had stepped up without a second thought? Behind the counter, one of Ethan's co-workers, a young man named Lucas, approached. "Hey, everything okay here?" Lucas asked, his eyes darting between Ethan and James. "It's fine," Ethan replied quickly, trying to dismiss him. Lucas glanced at James, then leaned in closer to Ethan. "You know we're not supposed to do stuff like this. If the manager finds out—" "I'll handle it," Ethan said firmly, cutting him off. Lucas hesitated but backed away, though his disapproving expression lingered. James stood there, clutching his cane, unsure of how to process the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. Shame and gratitude warred for dominance in his heart. He hadn't wanted to cause a scene, but the harsh words of the flannel man and the murmurs from the crowd stung deeply. He had always prided himself on his independence, but this moment was a stark reminder of how far he had fallen. As he looked at the young mother who had helped him, a small part of his hope rekindled. Her kindness reminded him of the days when neighbors looked out for each other, when people cared without expecting anything in return. But the other voices, the judgment, the suspicion, they reminded him of the wall society often built around people like him. James's thoughts drifted to his late wife, who had always been his rock during difficult times. He wondered what she would say if she saw him now. "She'd tell me to hold my head high," he thought, fighting back tears. "She'd remind me that dignity isn't about what others think. It's about how I carry myself." On the other side of the counter, Ethan wrestled with his own inner turmoil. He had always considered himself a decent person, someone who treated others fairly. But in this moment, he felt the full weight of his inaction. Why had he hesitated? Was it fear of breaking store policy, or fear of standing out? Ethan thought about his upbringing, about how he'd been taught to follow rules and avoid trouble. But he also thought about his mother, who had always told him to do the right thing, even when it's hard. This moment was challenging that belief in ways he hadn't expected. As he watched James, Ethan realized this wasn't just about a loaf of bread. It was about seeing someone in pain and deciding whether to turn away or step forward. Ethan took a deep breath, his decision beginning to crystallize. He knew that whatever he did next would have consequences, not just for his job, but for his sense of self. He glanced at the security cameras again, then at Lucas, who was still watching from the corner of the store. James, meanwhile, straightened his posture slightly, his resolve returning despite the humiliation he had just endured. He looked at Ethan, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and quiet determination. Ethan knew he couldn't ignore this moment. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but he felt the pull of something greater than store policy or societal expectations. He was about to make a choice that would define him, not just as a worker, but as a person. Ethan's heart pounded as he made his decision. Ignoring Lucas's lingering stare and the tension in the air, he stepped out from behind the counter and approached James. "Come with me," he said softly, gesturing toward the back of the store. James hesitated, unsure of what Ethan intended, but something in the young man's tone reassured him. Ethan led James to a small break room, away from the prying eyes of customers and cameras. The space was modest, a table, a few chairs, and a fridge stocked with employees' lunches. Ethan opened the fridge and pulled out a sandwich, an apple, and a bottle of water. He placed them on the table and motioned for James to sit. "Here," he said, his voice firm but kind. "Eat this. Take your time." James looked at the food, his hands trembling. "You don't have to do this, son," he said quietly. "I know," Ethan replied, meeting his gaze. "But I want to." As James began to eat, Ethan leaned against the counter, his mind racing. He knew this act of kindness might not sit well with his coworkers or his boss if they found out. But for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was doing something that mattered. As James ate, he began to open up, his voice gaining strength with each bite. "You know," he began, "I used to have a place like this, a little hardware store, back when my wife and I were younger. We'd help folks fix their homes, build their dreams. Ethan listened intently, the old man's words painting a picture of a life filled with purpose and community. We weren't rich, James continued, but we were happy. Then she got sick. Cancer. By the time we paid the bills, there wasn't much left. He paused, his eyes misting. I lost her, and not long after, I lost the store. Couldn't keep up with the rent. Been trying to get back on my feet ever since, but it's hard when you're my age. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He had assumed James's need was born of poor decisions or bad luck, but hearing the truth humbled him. This wasn't just a man in need. This was someone who had worked hard, loved deeply, and still found himself at the mercy of life's cruelties. You've been through so much, Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm sorry for what you've lost. James offered a faint smile. I've still got my pride, he said. And for what it's worth, I've still got faith in people. Folks like you remind me why. Ethan felt an overwhelming mix of emotions, shame for his earlier hesitation, anger at the world's indifference, and a profound respect for James's resilience. He thought about his own life, about how he had taken the stability of his job and home for granted. Compared to James's struggles, his own challenges felt insignificant. James finished the meal and pushed the empty plate aside. Thank you, he said, his voice steady. I don't know what I would have done without your kindness today. Ethan shook his head. I didn't do much, he said, but I should have done something sooner. You deserve better than this. At that moment, Ethan resolved to do more. He reached into his wallet and pulled out $20. This isn't much, he said, handing it to James, but it might help until you get back on your feet. James hesitated, then accepted the money with a nod. You've done more than enough, son, he said, his voice filled with gratitude. As James stood to leave, Ethan stopped him. Wait, he said. Give me your number. I want to check in on you. Maybe I can help you find something more permanent, a shelter, a food program, something. James's eyes widened in surprise, then softened. I'd like that, he said. For both men, the moment marked a turning point. James felt a renewed sense of dignity, while Ethan discovered a deeper capacity for empathy and action. The next morning, Ethan woke with a renewed sense of purpose. The encounter with James lingered in his mind, and he felt compelled to do more than offer a meal and a few dollars. During his lunch break, he began researching local resources, shelters, food banks, and community organizations that could help James regain stability. Ethan found a nearby nonprofit that provided assistance to seniors struggling with housing and food insecurity. After his shift, he called the organization, explaining James's situation. They promised to help if James was willing to connect. Later that evening, Ethan dialed the number James had left. When James answered, Ethan told him about the nonprofit and offered to accompany him to their office. I don't want you to feel alone in this, Ethan said. James hesitated for a moment, then agreed, his gratitude evident in his voice. The following day, Ethan picked James up and drove him to the nonprofit. The staff welcomed James warmly, offering him resources and setting him up with temporary housing and meal assistance. Ethan stayed by James's side through the process, ensuring he felt supported. Before they parted ways, James turned to Ethan. You've done more for me than anyone has in a long time, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I won't forget this. For Ethan, the experience was transformative. He began to see his job and community in a new light. The store wasn't just a place to clock in and out. It was a crossroads for people, each carrying their own struggles and stories. Ethan started small, keeping a discreet stash of food items for anyone in need and advocating for the store to partner with local charities. His co-workers, initially skeptical, began to support the idea. Lucas even admitted, you were right to help him. Maybe we should all be a little less afraid to step up. James, meanwhile, found a renewed sense of hope. With stable housing and regular meals, he began volunteering at the nonprofit, offering guidance to others who had fallen on hard times. He shared his story with humility and grace, inspiring those around him. The connection between Ethan and James grew beyond that first act of kindness. Ethan visited James regularly, and their conversations deepened his understanding of resilience, dignity, and the power of community. One evening, as Ethan sat with James on the porch of his new apartment, they reflected on the day they met. You know, James said, I walked into that store thinking I'd lost all my pride. But what I found was something I didn't expect. Hope. Ethan smiled. And I thought I was just doing my job, but you showed me what it means to really see someone. James chuckled softly. Funny how life works, isn't it? Sometimes the smallest acts make the biggest difference. Ethan nodded, realizing how much he had changed. He was no longer just a bystander in his own life. The experience had taught him that kindness wasn't just an action. It was a choice, one he wanted to make every day. As they talked, James pulled a small, worn keychain from his pocket. It was shaped like a house, the kind he used to sell at his hardware store. I want you to have this, James said, handing it to Ethan. Ethan hesitated. I can't take this. It's yours. James shook his head. It's a reminder that no matter how far we fall, there's always someone willing to help us stand again. Ethan accepted the keychain, turning it over in his hand. It felt light, yet heavy with meaning.